You walk through life, don't you? Breathing, seeing, hearing, feeling. But how much of that is you? And how much is the shadow that walks beside you, whispering, demanding, inflating? That shadow, my friends, is the ego. It's the voice that tells you you're better, you're worse, you're right, you're wronged. It's the architect of your pride and the sculptor of your insecurities. It tells you to chase the fleeting applause, to crave the validation of others, to build monuments to your own perceived greatness. And when you stumble, when you fall, it's the first to point the finger, to condemn, to remind you of every failure, every perceived slight. It thrives on comparison, on judgment, on the constant need to measure yourself against a world that, frankly, isn't paying that much attention. Look within, truly look. How many decisions have you made, not from a place of genuine conviction, but from the desperate need to protect an image, to avoid perceived humiliation, to feed that insatiable hunger for recognition? How much peace have you sacrificed on the altar of your ego's demands? It builds walls, not bridges. It fosters division, not unity. It screams for attention, yet leaves you feeling profoundly alone. The real you, the essence of who you are, is calm, it's compassionate, it's connected. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't need to win every argument. It doesn't crumble under criticism because its foundation is truth, not fragile self-importance. It understands that true strength lies in humility, in service, in the quiet pursuit of what is right, regardless of who is watching. So who will you listen to today? The loud, demanding, insecure voice of the ego, or the quiet, wise, and liberating voice of your true self? The battle is constant, but the choice, my friends, is always yours. The very first truth we must confront, the undeniable reality that shapes so much of our existence, is that the ego is not merely a part of us. It is in many ways the shadow that dictates our actions and perceptions. It is an unseen force, a constant companion, whispering in our ear, coloring our vision, and subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, steering the ship of our lives. This shadow isn't some external entity, it's an internal construct, a collection of beliefs, experiences, and identifications that we have built around ourselves, often unknowingly, since the dawn of our consciousness. Consider for a moment how you navigate the world. Every interaction, every decision, every thought you entertain, how much of it is truly a pure, unadulterated response from your authentic self, and how much is filtered through the lens of this shadow? The ego, you see, is fundamentally concerned with me and mine. It's the part that seeks to protect, to enhance, to defend, and to assert itself. It's the voice that immediately jumps to conclusions, that feels threatened by differing opinions, that craves validation, and recoils from criticism. It's the architect of the persona you present to the world, the meticulously crafted image designed to garner approval, respect, or even fear. Think about the simple act of choosing an outfit in the morning. Is it purely about comfort or practicality? Or does the shadow whisper, what will others think? Does this make me look successful? Am I fitting in? Am I standing out enough? These aren't questions from your core being. They are the ego's anxieties about its perceived standing in the social hierarchy. It dictates our choices, not always for our well-being, but for its own survival and enhancement. This dictation extends far beyond superficial choices. It permeates our perceptions. When someone offers a constructive critique, does your immediate reaction come from a place of open-mindedness, a willingness to learn and grow? Or does the shadow instantly rise, feeling attacked, misunderstood, or unfairly judged? It distorts the message, turning a potential lesson into a personal affront. It frames the world in terms of threat and opportunity, always with itself at the center. It perceives slights where none exist, magnifies minor inconveniences into major injustices, and interprets neutral events through the prism of its own insecurities. The ego is a master storyteller, constantly weaving narratives about who we are, what we deserve, and how others should behave towards us. It tells us we are victims, or heroes, or misunderstood geniuses. It exaggerates our triumphs and minimizes our failures, or conversely, wallows in self-pity and self-condemnation. These stories dictate our emotional responses, our reactions, and ultimately, the trajectory of our lives. We become enslaved by these narratives, believing them to be the absolute truth, when in reality, they are merely the ego's projections. Even our aspirations can be dictated by this shadow. Are you pursuing that career, that relationship, that material possession because it genuinely aligns with your deepest values and brings you true joy? Or is it because the ego tells you that achieving it will make you enough, will earn you respect, or will silence the nagging voice of inadequacy? The ego seeks external markers of success, not internal fulfillment. It drives us to accumulate, to achieve, to compete, often at the expense of our peace, our relationships, and our genuine well-being. The insidious nature of this dictation lies in its subtlety. We often mistake the ego's voice for our own. We believe its anxieties are our natural caution, its pride our deserved confidence, its defensiveness our righteous anger. But when we begin to observe this shadow, to separate its incessant chatter from the quiet wisdom of our true self, we gain a profound power. We start to see how much of our suffering, our conflict, and our dissatisfaction stems not from external circumstances, but from the ego's relentless need to control, to judge, and to be validated. It's a constant performance, a never-ending quest for a perfection that doesn't exist, driven by a fear of not being enough. This shadow, this dictating force, is the primary barrier to our inner peace and our connection to the world around us. The very same force that propels us to boast, to demand recognition, and to believe ourselves superior, is also the one that gnaws at our self-worth, whispers doubts, and paralyzes us with fear. This paradoxical duality is the ego's most cunning trick. It simultaneously fuels our pride and cultivates our deepest insecurities. It's a two-sided coin, where one face is the inflated sense of self-importance, and the other is the crippling fear of not being enough. Both are manifestations of the ego's fundamental preoccupation with its own image and perceived status. On one hand, the ego is the architect of pride. It takes our accomplishments, however minor, and magnifies them into monumental feats. It insists on being right, even when presented with irrefutable evidence to the contrary. It demands applause, recognition, and admiration, not for the joy of shared success, but for the reinforcement of its own perceived greatness. This is the part of us that finds it excruciatingly difficult to admit a mistake, to apologize genuinely, or to step back and allow another to shine. It fosters an arrogance that alienates others, building walls of self-importance that prevent genuine connection. When the ego is in control, every interaction becomes a subtle competition, every conversation an opportunity to assert dominance or display intellectual superiority. It's the voice that says, "I told you so," even when no one asked, and the one that dismisses the achievements of others to elevate its own. This pride isn't a healthy self-esteem, it's a fragile, inflated balloon that can burst with the slightest pinprick of reality. Yet this very same ego is also the fertile ground for insecurity. The moment that inflated balloon of pride is threatened, the insecurity lurking beneath the surface rushes forth. Because the ego's sense of worth is so heavily dependent on external validation and comparison, it is perpetually vulnerable. It constantly measures itself against others, finding endless ways to feel inadequate. If someone else achieves more, earns more, looks better, or is simply perceived as more successful, the ego immediately translates this into a personal failing. This leads to self-doubt, anxiety, and a pervasive feeling of not being good enough. The fear of failure becomes overwhelming, not because of the actual consequences, but because failure threatens the ego's carefully constructed image of competence and success. This insecurity can manifest as perfectionism, where the fear of making a mistake prevents any action at all, or as people-pleasing, where one sacrifices their own needs and desires to gain external approval. It makes us hypersensitive to criticism, interpreting any feedback as a direct assault on our entire being. The connection between pride and insecurity is profound and often overlooked. Pride is frequently a compensatory mechanism, a desperate attempt by the ego to mask its underlying feelings of inadequacy. The louder the boast, the more rigid the stance, the more deeply embedded the insecurity often is. When the ego's carefully constructed facade of superiority is challenged, the raw vulnerability of insecurity becomes painfully apparent. Conversely, the constant gnawing of insecurity can drive the ego to seek ever greater external achievements and recognition, hoping that enough accolades will finally silence the inner critic. It's a vicious cycle. The ego inflates itself with pride to escape insecurity, but this very inflation makes it more susceptible to the threats that feed insecurity. It's a self-perpetuating loop of seeking validation and fearing its loss, trapping us in a relentless pursuit of an external enoughness that can never truly be satisfied. The ego, in its relentless pursuit of self-preservation and enhancement, thus condemns us to a life oscillating between the fleeting high of pride and the debilitating low of insecurity. One of the most pervasive and often debilitating aspects of the ego is its insatiable hunger for external validation and applause. It's a relentless drive, a deep-seated need for affirmation from sources outside ourselves, a constant checking of the metaphorical mirror to ensure our reflection is approved by the world. This isn't about genuine connection or shared joy, it's about the ego's fragile sense of self-worth being propped up by the opinions and reactions of others. Without this external reinforcement, the ego feels diminished, uncertain, and even non-existent. Consider the modern landscape, particularly the digital realm, which has become a vast stage for the ego's performance. Every post, every share, every curated image is often at its core a plea for likes, comments, and shares. The number of followers, the engagement rate, the positive feedback, these become the metrics by which the ego measures its success and significance. When the applause comes, there's a fleeting rush, a temporary sense of importance. But this feeling is ephemeral, quickly dissipating, leaving the ego hungry for the next hit, the next round of affirmation. The absence of applause, or worse, the presence of criticism, can send the ego into a tailspin, leading to feelings of inadequacy, rejection, and even despair. It's a precarious existence, building one's entire sense of self on the shifting sands of public opinion. This craving for validation extends far beyond social media. In our professional lives, the ego often seeks promotion, recognition, and public praise not solely for the intrinsic satisfaction of achievement, but for the external markers of success that validate its perceived competence and status. We might work longer hours, take on more responsibilities, or even compromise our values, all in the pursuit of that coveted title, that public commendation, or that raise that signifies our worth in the eyes of others. The joy of the work itself, the fulfillment of contribution, often takes a backseat to the ego's demand for external acknowledgement. The moment that acknowledgement is withheld, or given to someone else, the ego feels slighted, resentful, and undervalued. In relationships, the ego's need for validation can manifest as a constant demand for attention, reassurance, and approval from loved ones. It might lead to manipulative behaviors, passive aggression, or a perpetual need to be seen as the good one, the smart one, or the sacrificing one. The ego wants to be admired, adored, and prioritized, and when it feels these needs aren't being met, it can lead to conflict, resentment, and a deep sense of loneliness, even within intimate connections. It struggles to give love freely, without expectation of return, because its primary concern is what it can get to feed its own sense of importance. The problem with relying on external validation is that it is an endless, unsatisfying pursuit. No amount of praise, no number of accolades, no degree of external approval can ever truly fill the void that the ego perceives within itself. It's like trying to quench thirst with salt water. The more you consume, the thirstier you become. The ego's hunger is insatiable because it is fundamentally looking in the wrong place. True worth, true confidence, and true peace come from an internal source, from an understanding of one's inherent value that is independent of what anyone else thinks or says. When we are driven by the ego's need for applause, we become slaves to the opinions of others, constantly adjusting our behavior, our beliefs, and even our very identity to fit what we perceive will earn us approval. This leaves us feeling inauthentic, exhausted, and perpetually unfulfilled, forever chasing a fleeting echo of validation that can never truly satisfy the soul. At the very core of the ego's operating system lies a relentless, insidious process, the constant act of comparison and judgment. It is the engine that drives so much of our internal monologue, perpetually evaluating ourselves against others, and others against our own preconceived notions. This isn't a benign observation. It's a deeply ingrained habit that fuels a cycle of dissatisfaction, envy, and a distorted sense of self. The ego, in its desperate attempt to establish and maintain its identity, cannot simply exist. It must constantly measure itself against everything and everyone else. Think about how often your mind drifts to what others possess, what they have achieved, or how they appear. They have a bigger house, their career is more successful, they look happier, they're smarter. This endless tallying is the ego at work, always seeking to establish a hierarchy, to find its place, to determine if it is better than or worse than. If it perceives itself as better, it inflates with a temporary sense of superiority, often leading to arrogance or condescension. This fleeting high is precarious, however, as there will always be someone else who appears to have more, do more, or be more. The moment that perceived superiority is challenged, the ego plungates into the depths of insecurity and envy. This constant striving to be on top is exhausting and ultimately futile, as the goalposts are always shifting. Conversely, if the ego perceives itself as worse, it plunges into self-pity, resentment, and a profound sense of inadequacy. It highlights its own perceived flaws and failures, magnifying them in comparison to the idealized versions of others. This can lead to a paralyzing fear of not being enough, a reluctance to take risks, and a constant feeling of being left behind. The joy of one's own journey is lost in the shadow of another's perceived progress. This comparison robs us of contentment, preventing us from appreciating our unique path and the blessings we already possess. It fosters a perpetual state of longing and dissatisfaction, always looking outward for what we lack rather than inward for what we are. Hand in hand with comparison is the ego's penchant for judgment. To validate its own position, the ego often resorts to judging others. This judgment can be subtle, a quick mental critique of someone's appearance, intelligence, or choices, or it can be overt, expressed through gossip, criticism, and condemnation. The ego judges others to elevate itself, to create a sense of moral or intellectual superiority, or simply to deflect attention from its own perceived shortcomings. If I can point out their flaws, then perhaps my own won't seem so glaring. This act of judgment creates separation, building invisible walls between people. It prevents empathy, understanding, and genuine connection, as we are constantly filtering others through our own biased lens of right and wrong, good and bad. Moreover, the ego's judgment is not limited to others, it is equally harsh and relentless in its judgment of ourselves. Every mistake, every misstep, every perceived imperfection becomes fodder for self-condemnation. The inner critic, a powerful voice of the ego, constantly reminds us of our failings, our shortcomings, and our unworthiness. This self-judgment erodes confidence, stifles creativity, and traps us in a cycle of shame and guilt. It prevents us from learning from our experiences, as the focus shifts from growth to punishment. Breaking free from this cycle of comparison and judgment is a profound act of liberation. It means recognizing that each individual's journey is unique, that true worth is not found in external metrics or the opinions of others, and that compassion, both for ourselves and for others, is a far more powerful force than critique. The ego, however, clings to comparison and judgment because they are fundamental tools it uses to define itself and maintain its illusion of control. Releasing them means stepping into a space of acceptance and presence, where the need to measure and evaluate simply dissolves. The ego, in its relentless pursuit of self-preservation and enhancement, is a master architect of separation. It does not build bridges, it constructs formidable walls both within ourselves and between us and the world. This inherent tendency to divide and categorize is one of its most destructive traits, fostering an environment of isolation and conflict, rather than connection and harmony. It operates on a fundamental principle of us versus them, a binary worldview where everything is either for me or against me, good or bad, right or wrong, always with the ego's perspective as the ultimate arbiter. Consider how the ego's mechanism of judgment, which we've explored, directly contributes to this wall building. When we judge another person, we immediately create a psychological distance. We place them in a box, label them, and in doing so we cease to see them as a complex, multifaceted human being. Instead, they become a caricature, defined by our critique. This act of judgment prevents empathy, for how can one truly connect with someone they have already mentally condemned or dismissed? The wall goes up, thick and impenetrable, blocking the flow of understanding and compassion. We remain safe within our own perceived superiority or righteousness, but at the cost of genuine human connection. Similarly, the ego's obsession with comparison, whether it leads to feelings of superiority or inferiority, inherently fosters division. If I constantly compare myself favorably to you, I create a hierarchy where I am above you. This breeds arrogance and a lack of respect, making true collaboration or mutual appreciation impossible. If I constantly compare myself unfavorably, I may feel envy or resentment, which are equally divisive emotions. These comparisons, driven by the ego's need to define itself relative to others, prevent us from seeing the inherent worth and unique journey of each individual, including our own. The focus shifts from shared humanity to competitive isolation. Pride, another hallmark of the ego, acts as a particularly tall and unyielding wall. When the ego is inflated with pride, it becomes rigid, unwilling to admit fault, to compromise, or to truly listen. It insists on being right, even at the expense of truth or relationship. This defensiveness shuts down dialogue and understanding, creating an impasse where genuine resolution becomes impossible. The ego would rather cling to its perceived correctness than find common ground.
preferring to stand alone on its self-proclaimed pedestal than to risk the vulnerability of true connection. This stubbornness, born of fear, pushes others away and reinforces the ego's isolated fortress. Beyond individual interactions, the ego scales its divisive tendencies to a collective level, fostering widespread division. It thrives on group identity, creating us versus them mentalities that pit families against families, communities against communities, and nations against nations. My religion is superior, my political ideology is the only correct one, my culture is more advanced. These are the ego's collective pronouncements, designed to create a sense of belonging and superiority for the in-group, while simultaneously demonizing or devaluing the out-group. This tribalism, fueled by collective egos, is the root of prejudice, discrimination, and conflict on a grand scale. It prevents us from recognizing our shared humanity, focusing instead on superficial differences that the ego magnifies into insurmountable barriers. The constant need to be right, to win, to dominate, or to be validated, all stem from the ego's fear-based existence. And fear, above all, is the ultimate divider. It breeds distrust, suspicion, and a reluctance to open up. When we operate from a place of egoic fear, we see potential threats everywhere, leading us to build higher walls and to retreat further into our isolated selves. This perpetual state of division, both internal and external, ultimately leads to profound loneliness, misunderstanding, and a world fractured by the very force designed to protect us.